Okay, let's do the second part of the notes, 2.5. On this section, we're going to be writing equations, right? What kind of equations? We're talking about absolute value equations. We're going to have to create absolute value equations given the solutions on a number line. Okay, so let's take a look at, here's an example down here. Up here is where we're going to jot down our notes. So I'm going to give you this little piece of paper, and you're going to jot down some notes up here, and here's our example down here that we're going to do. So this is the setup. Right here we're going to have midpoint, and over here it's going to be the distance from the point to the midpoint. Let me show you. There's the setup. Once again, right here, everybody write down midpoint. Okay, so we're going to have the absolute value of x minus midpoint. Okay, and then over here equals a certain number, and that number is going to be the distance from the point to the midpoint. Yes, we're going to have to memorize this, guys. I apologize. We are going to have to memorize this. So let's go back to the example that we were looking at. We have a dot right here at -2, a dot right here at 6. That means that the answers are x equals -2 and x equals +6. Now, let's identify the number we're going to put in here, okay? And that number is going to be the midpoint. So if you have a dot here and a dot there, I'm showing you that there's equal distance, the midpoints here. But the easy way of doing it is just count one in, another one, another one, another one. You're right here at 2. 2 is the midpoint. 2 is the midpoint right there, okay? So when I set up my absolute value equation, I'm going to write the absolute value of x minus, and what did we say the midpoint was? The midpoint is the value 2. So I'm going to plug in that value right there. And then it says equals a number. What is that number? It's the distance from point to midpoint. The distance from point to midpoint. Doesn't matter if you go this way or this way. If this point is in the middle, this distance is equal to this distance. So anyways, it's the distance from this point to the midpoint. So what is the distance? How many units? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so this number is the number 4. So let's put equals, let's put a 4 out here. Again, it doesn't matter if you went from here 1, 2, 3, 4, or if you went from over here 1, 2, 3, 4. And ladies and gentlemen, you are done. You have the absolute value equation right here. We created it just by knowing that the answer is -2 and +6. We created an absolute value equation that will give us the answer -2 and +6. Okay, once again, the setup is this: absolute value of x minus the midpoint, you actually have to count and find the midpoint, equals the distance from the point to the midpoint. It doesn't matter if you go from this point to that point or this point to that midpoint. So anyways, we created that. The midpoint was 2. The distance was 4. And let's actually prove to you that this equation down here will actually give us the answers -2 and 6. Let's solve it. So let's make some space here. Whoa, where did that equal sign go? I put it up there. There we go. And remember, how do we solve these guys? We set up a positive situation and also a negative situation. And of course, we need to put a line so we don't confuse the two. Now, how do we write this positive situation? You write it exactly the way it is without the absolute value sticks, right? Without the absolute values. So let's write the positive situation. There it is, x minus 2 equals 4. Now for the negative situation, it's the same exact thing. Just like over here, it says x minus 2 equals, I'm going to write down x minus 2 equals, but instead of 4, it's going to be a -4. Okay. So the only difference between the positive situation and the negative is that you slap on a negative sign onto the right side of your equal sign. Anyhow, now we're going to solve both. Let's solve this one by adding 2 and adding 2. So your x comes down, your equals comes straight down, right? And 4 plus 2 is 6. That is your answer, x equals 6. Let's do the negative situation one. Plus 2 cancels, plus 2. -4 plus 2 is -2. Equal sign comes down, x comes down, x equals -2. As you could see, guys, x equals -2 up here, x equals +6 up here. We have a match, 6 and 2. So we really did create an equation that gave us the answers -2 and 6. And again, all this came from, it all came from just looking at a number line and them giving us the answers and us identifying the point in the middle, the midpoint, which happens to be 2. Plug in that value of 2 right there, and then you count the distance from the midpoint to the other point, or from the point to the midpoint, which is 4 units. So again, the midpoint was 2, that's why I put a 2 right here inside of the absolute value. It's always x minus. And the distance was 4, so we put a 4 out here. That's our equation, and that's how you do it. Let's jump to the actual homework from yesterday, 2.5 WSPM. And I already have the homework right here. And let's jump to those last 4 questions, okay? So number 11, the midpoint. What is the midpoint? Of course, we have these two answers, -1 and +1. So what is the midpoint? Well, the midpoint is obviously right here, right in the middle. So when you set this up, x minus the midpoint. What is the midpoint? We said the midpoint was 0, so x minus 0 equals, and then the distance, says up here, the distance from the point to the midpoint. From the point to the midpoint, what's the distance? How many units are you going from here to here? You're going 1 unit only. So the outside value says equals 1. And that is correct. That this is the correct absolute value equation. But of course, x minus 0 is just x. So you could write it like this. X inside the absolute value equals 1. And if you were to solve that, it would give you both answers, -1 and +1. Let's move on to number 12. We have an answer of -5, and we also have an answer of -1. Let's start by finding the midpoint. So let's go 1 in, 1 in. This is the midpoint right here, perfectly in the middle. That is -3. So -3 is the midpoint. So when we set this up, we're going to do absolute value. Maybe I should do it down here. Let me see. Absolute value of x minus, and that midpoint happens to be -3. Let me do it in a different color. -3. That's a midpoint value, -3. So whenever you have a minus minus, you have to change it to plus plus. So remember, that's going to be a +3 at the end of it all. Now we do need the outside right-hand side of the equation value, which is the distance from the point to the midpoint. So how far is it from here to the middle? It's 1, 2 units. Or from here to the middle, it's 1, 2 units. So it's going to be equal to 2. So to make this as nice as possible, it's going to be the absolute value of x plus 3 equals 2. Believe it or not, if you were to solve this by doing a positive and a negative situation, you will get the answer -5 and -1. Let's move on to number 13. Number 13 has an answer right here at 3 and also at 5, okay? Which means that the midpoint happens to be 4, not after. You get it? Before. Okay, that was dumb. Anyway, so let's set up our absolute value equation. The absolute value, I do it in black, of x minus +4, close absolute value, equals the distance from a point to the midpoint, the distance from 3 to 4. What's the distance there? That's 1 unit. So that's a 1 out there. And ladies and gentlemen, we are done. That is your absolute value equation. That will produce the answers 3 and 5. Let's try another one. We the best math. What? Okay. DJ's. Oh, all right. Anyway, number 14. So we have an answer, -4 and +4. What is the midpoint? Clearly, the midpoint is 0. So when you set this up, you're going to have the absolute value of x minus the value of the midpoint is 0 equals the distance from the point to the midpoint. So 1, 2, 3, 4, obviously 4. So what's the final best looking absolute value equation that we want right here? Just x, absolute value of x equals 4. And of course, the two answers that it would give you if you did solve this would be -4 and +4. And it's really that easy, guys. This is the setup right here, the setup. The absolute value of x minus the midpoint is equal to the distance from the point to the midpoint. That's all there is to it.